Welcome to another episode of Genre Art with JB. It's been quite a minute. I've been super busy getting into convention season. So I have a few conventions coming up. I have a convention I'll be doing in the fall, which I'll get into more detail later on my channel concerning that convention. I should add, by the way, that all the conventions I'm doing this year, 2022, are going to be local Vermont shows. I recently did the Vermont Sci-Fi and Comic Expo, and that was a very, very positive experience. And on June 25th and 26th, I'll be doing the Vermont Renaissance Fair in Stowe. And this piece that I am working on in the video here will be for sale. I'll be doing a bunch of Middle-earth gouache pieces and commissions that I'll have on sale, as well as prints, playmats, more details forthcoming on that. You can also check out my website. I have a news item up concerning the Vermont Red Fair, so I'll put that in the description below. But what I wanted to do was just circle back around to some art tutorials. I know I have another Book of Boba Fett review that I have to do, and I will get that out. I promise. That is the series finale review, a belated Book of Boba review. How's that for alliteration? But what I wanted to do was really just circle back, take a break from my reviews, and come back to doing some tutorials and or art demos. So what I'm doing here is I'm painting, as I said, I'm painting a watercolor and gouache illustration of Bagend, specifically the Peter Jackson version of Bagend. And I wanted to get into some painting best practices today and just go over some best practices and some color mixing pointers with all of you today. So as far as watercolor best practices go, the first thing you want to have whenever you're doing a watercolor, such as the one in the video here, is you'll notice I have a really detailed and solid underdrawing. The drawing is 90% of the painting. And if you're doing a detailed scene, small format, what you want to do is once you have your drawing all done, you want to lightly prime your paper with a thin film of water. And I have done that here. I've lightly primed this paper with a thin film of water before going in with any of my paints. And then once you've lightly primed your paper, and in this case I only primed the sky and a little bit past the edge of the sky. So with architecture and more detailed inorganic elements, what I'll tend to do if I'm doing a scene is I work in sections. Right, so I'm doing the sky first. I'm going a little past the edge of the sky so that paint will bleed in and blend into the edge of the hill when I paint the hill. But you want to lightly prime your paper with a thin film of water, and the paper should be wet but not saturated. Right, that's the other thing, is you don't want to see when I teach adults and even little kids. What I see is that sometimes they tend to drench the paper, and then it curls and bows and starts coming up out of the tape. You don't want to do that. You really want to make sure that you are keeping your paper not saturated. Right. And then the next thing you want to do is, in your watercolor, always work light to dark, right? So you'll notice that I'm working light to dark. Right now what I'm doing is I'm actually pre-mixing some colors. I'll get into color mixing a little bit later in the video here. But for now, I want to continue on my train of thought regarding these painting best practices. The other thing you'll notice what I'm doing is I'm starting with a big flat brush, and I'm working my way down to a smaller brush, right? So you always want to start with a big flat and work your way down to a small round brush. I use a variety of brushes when I paint, but I always have a big flat, a medium filbert, a medium round, and a small round. So again, I have a big flat, a medium filbert, and a filbert is just a combination of a round. It's a flat brush with a round tip. And then I have a medium round and a small round for detail work. And then lastly, when using your large flat, paint in the big shapes first. You'll notice right away here, I'm painting in all of the big shapes, right? I'm not starting with small shapes. I've painted in my big shapes, I've masked in my sky, my tree, I've masked in the hill as well, trying to get as much ground covered as possible, right? So that's another thing that a lot of artists typically, they don't do. They'll hone in on one section of the painting and they'll get stuck there. They won't paint in their big shapes first. You always want to paint in your big shapes first. And then lastly, you'll also notice that I work from the back to the front of the image. So you, again, always want to work from the back to the front of the image, right? That will help you, as you're going along, adjust for your values and, you know, come up with a coherent light source. If you're sort of doing imaginative realism, which this sort of is actually, you'll notice occasionally you'll see my forearm sneak into the frame there. That's because I'm actually using a bunch of reference that I've collated off the internet, gathered off the internet and collated, and I have a Rolodex of reference images that I'm using for this particular version of bagend, and there I go, going crazy on the internet again. So I have different references for different sections of my painting, so this is sort of an example of imaginative realism. Right. So, next, moving on to some color mixing, right? Color mixing, there's a lot that goes into color mixing. In particular, some things you want to keep in mind when color mixing is you always want to start, you know, in any kind of painting, you want to start with a small, limited palette. That works best, right? However, if you've been painting a while and you're working in a fast-drying medium, such as gouache or watercolor, you can pre-mix colors based on what area of the image you're painting, right? So painting in sections. And then you can supplement that with swatches from a travel kit, pre-mixed watercolors, and use those to lay in transparent effects. Basically, what I'm doing here is as I'm painting, I'm using my pre-mixed colors, and as those are drying, I'll lay in transparent effects on top using the swatches from my travel kit. I typically use my filbert or a large round as both a mixing brush and a paint brush, right? And that gets into something else that I'll touch on later on in the video, which is painting dirty, right? I think, you know, one of the things that we do is that when we're painting, we don't always perceive the true color we're seeing. We tend to boil colors down into their archetypical, synthesized incarnations, right? But in reality, when we are looking at something, we're actually seeing a lot of gray and a lot of grit in that color in real life that our eye is subconsciously picking up on. So we want to be aware of that, and that goes into painting dirty, right? And you'll notice my palette is quite dirty here. One of the other things that I want to touch on as I'm going through this is the way in which I load the color. The way I load my color is similar to when I paint oil, where I have a solvent. In the case of oil paint, that solvent is a mixture of paint medium, terpenoid for cleaning, and linseed oil, right? So I actually, the last piece I completed, I used a lot of linseed oil, but what I'll do is I'll typically clean my brush off with terpenoid, maybe load up a tiny bit of linseed oil on that brush, just get a little bit of oil on the tip, and then mix it into whatever color I'm loading my brush with. Then test it on the paper towel, test it on my color checker, and then go in. In watercolor, similar but slightly different, what I'm doing is I am slightly wetting the brush, and then I am dabbing it on the paper towel, loading my brush up, and then testing it on a piece of scratch off. And if it's too dry, what I do is I'll clean it. I'll load my brush up with water. So I load my brush up with water, then I go into the paint, then I'll test it and dab it again. If I find that there's a little excess, it usually comes off on the paper towel, and then I'll go right into my painting. So the water, when you're loading up your color, your brush in watercolor, is you want to wet your brush, you want to load it up with some color, not too much, but a little bit on the tip. And then what you want to do is, while your brush is semi-wet, load it up with the paint. You want to dab it a little bit on the paper towel to make sure you're getting some of that excess off. And then you want to go right into your painting and spread it around. Go side to side, kind of move that color around. Let the medium do the work for you. And if you're finding that you're not getting as much coverage or movement as you want, what you can do is you don't even need to load your brush up again. Just go right in, wet your brush, dab it on the paper towel to get off the excess, and then apply that wet brush to the color already on your paper, and you'll find that you can move that color around easy right there as it's sitting on your paper, and just kind of move it around and extend the coverage that you're getting. So that's something else that you want to keep in mind about, the way in which you load your brush, right? So it's important when you are mixing colors that you let them dry before applying a new coat, right? And this particularly applies to darks. Dark shadows don't dry as fast as light ones. So what I do is I lay in my darks and I make sure I give my darks extra time to dry before applying transparent effects using any of the swatches from the travel kit. I find that if you do not do that, then what happens is, let's say you lay in a dark shadow or something, what will happen is you will go right in to try to maybe muddy up that dark, give it a little heat, give it a little coolness, maybe work in a blue, work in a green, or even like overlay it, try to create haze. What will happen is, if that dark isn't completely dry, because darks are more inherently unstable, not just and more intense, not just in watercolor, but in any kind of medium of painting, almost across the board. That dark will, in watercolor, it will turn into chalk. It'll come off of the paper. You'll take that dark right off. So if you go into a shadow and it's not completely dry and you paint over that shadow, what you're going to be doing is you're actually going to be taking that shadow off the paper. It's almost like over oiling your surface in oil painting, and then you're going into that surface while it's over oiled, and let's say you apply you mix too much linseed into your paint, and then you apply it to your oil painting, using a color, and you have a thin film of that color on your board, and then you go in while that thin film is wet, trying to layer it, and assuming that you don't have enough tooth, what it's going to do in oil is it's going to pick up that paint and it's going to yank it right off the surface. That goes into another thing about surfaces that I actually want to mention that I almost forgot to mention here, is that when I'm painting in watercolor, you want a little bit of a tooth. Some watercolorists really prefer like the crazy cold press, like hardcore, like fancy aquarelle, like French watercolor paper. That typically is what we call 300 pound, and what that means is if you're getting 300 pound watercolor paper, that means the paper is going to have a lot of tooth to it. That also means, though, that you're going to get a lot of blotting, a lot of mixing, and a lot of blotting. It's going to really hold the paint. But that's the thing, is if you're working with 300 pound, you're probably going to want to have a really solid underdrawing with a hard lead. What happens is, when you're painting in watercolor, the lead on the paper actually forms like a little bit of a substrate barrier, so that when you blot your color in, that color will blot until it goes up to the pencil line typically, and then the pencil line will act as a little bit of a natural barrier to prevent it from blotting further. You're also going to probably, with the 300 pound watercolor paper, be resorting to using masking fluid to do the painting in stages if you're working on architecture, because it's going to be a little difficult to control that blotting, especially if you're a beginner. So what I recommend is I actually work on 140 pound paper. 140 pound is good because it's a happy medium between lack of control and like not enough tooth to really hold the paint. 140 pound has enough of a tooth where you can take a decent amount of water, and it can take a decent amount of the watercolor at one time, but it doesn't have so much of a tooth, and it's not so thick that it will automatically blot like crazy when you throw it down. So I really like the Strathmore 140 pound watercolor paper. That's the paper that I typically would use, and I use that when I teach. So yeah, basically, again, to circle back around to dark shadows do not dry as fast as light areas. So what I do is I lay in my darks, and I make sure I give my darks extra time to dry before applying transparent effects. Right? If you're working with a large format, like let's say you're working bigger than 8x10, right? You really want to wait at least 24 hours in between coats to allow that painting to dry. I know that seems a little tedious, but watercolor is not a medium for those who are impatient or want to keep working into things. The thing to remember with watercolor is you got to have a game plan when you're going into these types of paintings. Very important to have a game plan, right? You don't want to just go in with no game plan. At the end of the layering process, I will add in some super highlights by mixing my lights or yellows with some white gouache. I also mix in gray gouache to help buttress my clouds, and I've done that in that cloud sky. There's a fair bit of gouache in that cloud sky. Touching on color palettes, some good color palettes, and there's the Zorn palette and the primary color palette, and for the purposes of this video, I have other videos on the Zorn palette, and I'll put those in the description as well, or I'll put those in the cards. Basically, what we're going to be doing is the primary color palette, and your primary color palette, it constitutes red, blue, yellow, and we typically pair this with hues black and white, right? And then to mix your secondary colors, blue and yellow will get you green, red and yellow will get you orange, blue and red will give you purple. To get brown, what you're going to want to do is add 1/4 black, 1/4 red, 2/4 yellow, and that will give you brown. If you want to get a yellow ochre, which is what we use as one of the 4 colors under the Zorn palette, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to do 1/3 brown, and then you're going to want to do 2/3 yellow, and that will get you yellow ochre or khaki, right? So that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind, right? And then when you're mixing darks, it's good to work in some grays. That's the other thing you want to think about, right? When you're mixing in your darks, you want to always paint dirty, and that gets back to what I mentioned before about your eye perceiving color unconsciously, right? And you can see my earlier videos for how to paint, how to make a palette in oil, and making a gray line, which also that also is the Zorn palette video that I did. So that's a ways back. I'll put the link for that again in the cards. The idea behind mixing grays into neutrals and particularly darks is to dirty the color, right? So when we see color in real life, what we are doing what we tend to do is preconceive, right? Well, colors are not perfect flat tones. They have a dirtiness and a grit to them, and our eye unconsciously picks up this grit and this dirtiness. So you want to always add a little bit of gray into your color, typically. Not always, but you always want to be mixing. You're always going to be mixing one or more colors. A lot of the colors you'll be doing are compound colors, and typically with earth tones you are mixing in a fair bit of gray. Even in flesh tone, certain areas of the form in flesh tone will have a fair bit of gray in them. And this idea of dirtiness also translates to blacks, right? So one last bit on blacks. Pure black does not actually exist in nature, at least not in a large part in nature. Blacks either go really cool or have a bit of a warmth to them. And so you want to be able to make both warm and cool blacks, right? So how do we do that, right? How do we make warm and cool blacks? Well, I'll tell you. Basically, to make a cool black, what you want to do is you want to add a bit of blue to that black, right, to cool it off, and that will give you a more intense, cool black. To make a subtle or more warm black with a bit of warmth in it, you can add a dark green to it, right? So that's typically what I'll do, to make my blacks. And when I'm painting faces, what I'll typically do is I will make I'll use more warm blacks when I'm painting my faces, unless it's the side of the face and stark 3/4 lighting. At that point I may switch to a cool black, right? I've done that a few times, but typically I do like to use like a warm black when I'm painting faces. So you can see that my bag end is really coming along here. It's almost done. I've covered the sort of process of this piece from soup to nuts, and hopefully I've imparted a lot of valuable information to you today in my little monologue about watercolor painting. I'll be doing more of these sort of watercolor paint streams slash tutorials talking about my process as I'm, showing you in real time painting an actual piece. I'll also be doing some more individualized tutorial videos regarding just like, different aspects of what went into this. So for instance, I may have a short video just dealing with like primary color palette, right? I may have another short video just dealing with black, mixing grays and blacks, similar to the section of my long form video regarding my dragon painting, where I do go into the Zorn palette and I do go into mixing grays. But yeah, I mean, basically with watercolor, again, you can see that I've been quite patient. I've done this in several sittings. At this point, I'm going in, just starting to add some details. I've worked my way from the back to the front. Now I'm painting in the door there, and I've laid in my light color, and now I'm going in with the dark. I know my big head's in the way every 10 seconds, but every time I pull back, you can see I'm adding a little bit more to that hobbit hole door there. And like I said, I do like working on this at this format because it tends to go a little quicker, being that watercolor is one of those mediums. If you're doing any kind of architecture, we really want to like just take your time with it. And you can see that bush in the foreground I haven't quite gotten to yet. I don't know if I get to it actually by the end of this video. I know I get pretty close to done with, I'll post the finished, you'll see the finished version of this in the thumb, obviously. So I'm doing a series of these Middle-earth gouache pieces, again, for the Vermont Ren Fair in Stowe. And there I am looking at my compound reference. And what I've been doing is I have been using my travel kit. What I'll do is I'll create a solution by mixing some water over the swatch of my travel kit, and while my brush is still wet, loaded up with some of that travel kit paint, I'll mix it into some of the premix paint that I've made to either alter a brown that I have, lighten a brown, or add some heat to a green, or darken a brown or darken a green, right, depending on what my needs are. So I'm sort of ping-ponging right now back and forth between my travel kit and my premix colors. And I'm loading that brush in exactly the same order as I specified earlier. But yeah, really liking this piece. This was a real beauty. So I know I just completed a Smaug piece, and again, hopefully that you found the information that I discussed in this video beneficial, and I'll be doing more like detailed breakdowns. This is more of a general overview of my process, with some painting best practices and principles outlined, and these are good for beginners to follow, for anybody to follow. But I'll also be going into some more detailed breakdown videos where we really stop, take a deep breath, and focus in on, okay, today we're going to make a palette, today we're going to do some grays, right, that sort of thing. But this is the application. What you're seeing in the video is these painting best practices applied, right? Not only going over theory, right, but we're going over application, and we're seeing that application in real time. So that's something that I wanted you guys to see. And again, we will be doing more Book of Boba videos in the future, or one last Book of Boba video to round out that series, because I am a completionist. But I will be circling back around to doing some tutorials for a while, although there are some other shows I do want to review in the future. But again, I hope you had a great time today, and thank you for joining me on this latest episode of Genre Art with JB. Like, share, and subscribe.